The summers of my childhood were marked by endless days spent at my grandparents' house by the lake. It was a remote, secluded place, surrounded by thick woods and shrouded in mist most mornings. The lake itself was vast and still, its waters dark and mysterious, a mirror reflecting the sky and the trees in perfect eerie symmetry. I remember the way the air would hang heavy with moisture, the scent of wet leaves and earth filling my lungs. There was a quiet to the place, a stillness that was both calming and unsettling. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of a loon, and the soft lapping of the water against the shore. My grandparents' house was old and weathered, a creaky, sprawling structure with peeling paint and sagging porches. It had been in the family for generations, passed down from my great-grandparents to my grandparents, who spent their retirement years there, far from the bustle of the city. To me, it was a place of endless wonder and adventure, a sanctuary where I could lose myself in the woods, exploring and imagining all manner of fantastical things. But as I grew older, I began to notice the strange, unsettling atmosphere that seemed to pervade the place. There was something about the lake, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, a feeling that I was being watched from beneath the surface. My grandparents never spoke of it directly, but I could sense their unease, the way their eyes would dart nervously to the water whenever they thought no one was looking. My grandfather, a man of few words, often warned us not to swim too far from the shore, his voice gruff and serious. "There are things in that lake," he would say, his eyes dark and distant, "things that don't belong to this world." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. To me, the lake was just a lake, a place to splash and play and catch fish. But as the years passed, I began to notice things, strange, inexplicable things that made me question everything I had ever known about that place. There was the time my cousin Jacob went missing, for one. He was only 8 years old, a year younger than me, and we had been playing by the water's edge, skipping stones and chasing dragonflies. I remember turning around for just a moment, distracted by something in the woods, and when I looked back, he was gone. The adults searched for days, scouring the woods, dragging the lake, but they never found him. It was as if he had been swallowed whole by the earth. And then there were the whispers. I would hear them at night, lying in bed with the window open to let in the cool breeze. Soft, indistinct voices carried on the wind from the direction of the lake. They were too faint to make out any words, but there was something in their tone, something that sent a chill down my spine. I would pull the covers up to my chin and squeeze my eyes shut, praying for sleep to take me before the whispers grew louder. But the most disturbing thing of all was the woman. I saw her for the first time when I was 14. It was late summer, the last few days before we would return home and I would start high school. I was sitting on the dock, my feet dangling in the water, watching the sun set over the lake. The sky was a riot of colors, deep oranges and purples, streaked with the last rays of the sun. The water was calm, undisturbed, a perfect reflection of the sky above. And then I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the lake, far from the shore, her figure pale and ghostly in the fading light. She was facing away from me, her long dark hair trailing in the water, her arms hanging limply at her sides. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to look away. She was too far out to be standing, yet there she was, her feet seemingly anchored to the lake bed beneath the dark water. I wanted to call out to ask who she was, what she was doing there, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt a deep, instinctual fear, a terror that I had never known before. Something was wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. And then slowly she turned to face me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark and hollow. Her mouth was a thin, bloodless line, and as she stared at me, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very air around me had grown thick and heavy, suffocating me. She raised one hand, pointing directly at me, and in that moment, I knew with every fiber of my being, that she wanted me to come to her, to join her in the depths of the lake. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and ran back to the house as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was inside. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the empty halls. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. I didn't want to believe it myself, didn't want to acknowledge the terror that had gripped me so completely. But I couldn't shake the image of her face, those hollow eyes staring into my soul, her outstretched hand beckoning me to join her in the depths. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft whispers that drifted in through the open window. They were louder now, more insistent, and I could almost make out words, though they were in a language I didn't understand. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, the soft, rhythmic splashing of water, as if someone were walking up the shore. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming closer, moving steadily up the path toward the house. I could hear it clearly now, the slosh of water-soaked footsteps, the rustle of wet fabric. I held my breath, my body trembling with fear, and then I heard it, a soft, wet knock at the door. The knock echoed through the house, low and deliberate, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against the wood. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, as the sound reverberated through the empty halls. My grandparents were asleep, their room on the other side of the house, too far to hear the knock. I was alone, the only one awake, the only one who knew. For a long moment, I sat there in bed, too terrified to move, too afraid to breathe. The soft splashing of water had stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. My eyes were fixed on the door to my bedroom, half expecting it to swing open on its own, to reveal her. But the door remained closed. Another knock, this time louder, more insistent. It echoed down the hall, a hollow, empty sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should go wake my grandparents, tell them that something or someone was outside, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The fear had paralyzed me, rooted me to the spot. The knocking continued, each one more forceful than the last, as if the visitor was growing impatient. I could feel the terror rising in my chest, a cold, suffocating dread that threatened to swallow me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence. For a moment, I didn't dare to hope, didn't dare to believe that it was over. I sat there listening, my heart pounding in my ears. But the house was quiet, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind through the trees outside. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling with relief. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it had all been a bad dream, a trick of the light, a figment of my overactive mind. But then, from the other side of the door I heard it, a soft, whispering voice, just barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. The voice was faint, almost ethereal, but there was no mistaking the words. "Let me in." I bolted out of bed, my heart leaping into my throat. The voice was unmistakably hers, soft, haunting, the same voice I had heard whispering in the darkness all those nights. She was outside, waiting for me just beyond the door. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, more insistent this time, as if she could sense my hesitation. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I couldn't let her in. I knew deep down that if I opened that door, if I allowed her to cross the threshold, I would be lost. She would take me, drag me down into the dark, cold depths of the lake, and I would never be seen again. But the voice continued, a soft, relentless plea that gnawed at my resolve, chipped away at my fear. "Please, let me in." My hand was shaking as I reached for the door, my mind a whirl of confusion and terror. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn and run, but something held me there, something in her voice, something in the way she spoke my name. And then, just as my fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob, I heard another sound, a soft, steady humming, coming from the direction of my grandparents' room. The tune was familiar, comforting, a lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me when I was a child. The sound seemed to cut through the fog of fear that had clouded my mind, grounding me, pulling me back from the brink. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a warmth, a sense of safety and love that I hadn't felt in years. I could almost see my grandmother's face, smiling down at me, her eyes full of warmth and kindness. The door to my grandparents' room creaked open, and my grandfather stepped out, his face stern, his eyes hard as steel. He didn't say a word, just looked at me, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I tore my hand away from the doorknob, stumbling back, and the voice outside let out a soft, mournful wail, like the cry of a wounded animal. The sound sent a shiver of terror down my spine, but I didn't look back, didn't hesitate. I turned and ran down the hall toward my grandparents' room, my heart pounding in my chest. My grandfather stepped aside, allowing me to pass, and as I entered the room, I caught a glimpse of his face, calm, resolute, as if he had known this moment would come. He followed me inside, closing the door behind us with a soft click, and the moment the door shut, the voice outside fell silent. The house was plunged into an eerie stillness, the only sound the soft humming of my grandmother, who was still asleep, her lips moving faintly with the tune. My grandfather placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "She can't get you in here," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "You're safe now." I wanted to ask him who she was, what she wanted, but the words caught in my throat. I could still hear the whispers in my mind, still feel the pull of her voice, the icy dread that had gripped me so completely. But my grandfather's presence was a balm, a steady anchor that kept me grounded, kept me safe. He guided me to a chair beside the bed where I sat down, my legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. "She's been after you for a long time," he said quietly, his eyes distant, as if he were recalling a memory from long ago. "Ever since that day by the lake, she's been waiting for her chance." I shivered, the memory of that day coming back to me in a rush. The woman in the lake, her pale face, her hollow eyes, the way she had beckoned to me, calling me to join her in the water. "Who is she?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My grandfather sighed, his expression grim. "She was a woman who drowned in that lake a long time ago. No one knows exactly how or why, but her spirit never found peace. She haunts the lake, luring people to their deaths, trying to drag them down to join her." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a sorrow I had never seen before. "She's been after you since you were a child. I've tried to protect you, but she's strong and she's patient. She almost had you tonight." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a stone. The fear that had gripped me earlier was still there, lurking in the corners of my mind, but it was tempered now by a new understanding, a sense of the danger that had been stalking me for years. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. My grandfather's face hardened, a steely resolve in his eyes. "We leave," he said simply. "We leave this place and never come back." And that's exactly what we did. The next morning, we packed our bags in silence, the weight of the previous night's events hanging heavily over us. My grandmother, still half asleep, was confused by our sudden departure, but my grandfather didn't offer any explanations. He simply loaded the car and drove away, leaving the lake and the woman behind. As we drove, I watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror, the misty lake fading into the distance. A part of me felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss for the place that had once been my sanctuary, my refuge. But that sadness was overshadowed by a deep, profound relief, a relief that I had escaped, that I was still alive. We never spoke of that night again, not to each other, not to anyone. My grandparents sold the house soon after, and we never returned to the lake. I went on with my life, went to school, grew up, and tried to put it all behind me. But the memory of that night stayed with me, lurking in the shadows of my mind, a reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed me. Years passed, and I thought I had finally left it all behind. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of her voice echoing in my ears. "Let me in." I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for the sound of wet footsteps in the hall, the soft knock at the door. But it never came. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting, biding her time. The lake may be far behind me, but I knew deep down that she would never stop searching, never stop trying to claim me. So I lived my life with the knowledge that one day she might find me again. One day I might hear her voice once more, beckoning me to the lake, calling me to join her in the cold, dark depths. But until that day comes, I will do everything in my power to stay away from the water, to keep my distance from the places where she might be lurking, waiting. And if that day ever comes, if she ever finds me again, I only hope I will be strong enough to resist her call, because if I'm not, I know there will be no escape. The lake will claim me, just as it claimed her, and I will be lost to the depths forever.
The forest near my childhood home had always been a place of mystery and fear. For as long as I can remember, my parents forbade me from entering it, even during the day. It was as if an invisible barrier separated our home from the thick, dark woods that loomed just beyond the backyard. The trees stood tall and menacing, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting the forest floor in perpetual shadow. The air was different there too, thicker, colder, and filled with an eerie silence that seemed unnatural. I was never told exactly why the forest was off limits, but the warning was always clear: stay out of the woods. Of course, as a child, my curiosity was piqued by this forbidden place. My friends and I would often dare each other to venture to the edge of the trees, but none of us ever had the courage to go further. We all had heard the stories, the whispered tales passed down through generations in our small town. Stories of people who had entered the woods and never returned, of strange lights seen flickering among the trees at night, and of a presence that watched from the shadows. The older I got, the more I dismissed these tales as just that, stories. But there was always a part of me that remained uneasy, a lingering sense of dread whenever I found myself too close to the tree line. Then, when I was 15, something happened that changed everything. It was a hot summer evening and my parents were hosting a barbecue for some family friends. The adults were gathered on the back deck, laughing and talking, while the younger kids played in the yard. I was sitting on the swing set, half listening to the conversation while staring at the forest, my mind wandering. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement among the trees, so quick and subtle that I almost thought I had imagined it. But then I saw it again, something tall and pale, slipping between the trees like a shadow. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, squinting to get a better look. But whatever it was, it had vanished. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching. That night, after everyone had left and my parents had gone to bed, I found myself unable to sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of the forest and the figure I had seen. The window next to my bed was open, letting in the cool night air, and I could hear the distant sound of crickets chirping. But there was something else too, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps in the grass. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my window. I held my breath, too terrified to move, as I heard the unmistakable sound of something or someone breathing. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, and that's when I saw it. A face, pale and ghostly, peering in at me from the darkness. Its eyes were large and black, reflecting the dim light of my room, and its mouth was stretched into a twisted grin. It was only there for a moment, but that moment felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I scrambled out of bed, slamming the window shut and pulling the curtains closed, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but I was paralyzed by fear, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. That night I barely slept, every creak and groan of the house sending my heart racing. By morning I had convinced myself that it had all been a nightmare, a figment of my overactive imagination. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Something was in the woods, and it was watching me. The days that followed were a blur of unease and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the thing I had seen outside my window was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the forest. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that it was there. But there was nothing. I tried to go about my daily routine, to push the memory of that night to the back of my mind, but it was always there, lurking in the corners of my thoughts. I became jumpy, startling at the slightest noise, and my parents began to notice. "Are you feeling all right, sweetheart?" my mom asked one morning as I picked at my breakfast, unable to stomach the food. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just didn't sleep well." She frowned, concern etched on her face, but she didn't press the issue. I knew they wouldn't believe me if I told them what I had seen. They would brush it off as a bad dream or an overactive imagination, just like I had tried to do. But I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to cling to me like a shadow. A week passed, and I began to think that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it really had been a trick of the light, or some kind of animal that had wandered too close to the house. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was safe. But then, one night it happened again. I was lying in bed, the house silent around me, when I heard it. The soft rustling of footsteps outside my window. My heart leaped into my throat and I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps grew closer, and then I heard the breathing, a slow, labored sound, like someone struggling to draw air into their lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would go away, that I was just imagining things. But the sound persisted, growing louder, closer, until it was right outside my window. And then, just like before, I felt its presence. I didn't dare open my eyes, too terrified of what I might see, but I could feel it, that same cold, malevolent energy seeping through the walls, pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was as if the very air around me had turned to ice, freezing me in place. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually the presence began to fade. The footsteps retreated, the breathing grew fainter, and the air in the room slowly warmed. But I didn't move, didn't open my eyes until I was certain it was gone. When I finally did, I found myself drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see that pale face staring back at me, but it was closed, the curtains drawn tight. I spent the rest of the night huddled under the covers, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What was it? Why was it here? And most importantly, what did it want? But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with any answers. All I knew was that it was out there and it was watching me. As the days turned into weeks, my fear began to morph into a kind of obsession. I became fixated on the idea of finding out what was in the woods, of uncovering the truth behind the presence that haunted me. It was as if I was being drawn to it, compelled to seek it out, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay away. I started spending more and more time near the edge of the forest, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I would sit on the swing set for hours, just staring into the darkness, waiting for it to appear. But no matter how long I watched, it never showed itself. At night, I would lie awake, listening for the sound of footsteps, the rasping breath, but the presence never returned to my window. It was almost as if it was toying with me, keeping its distance but never fully leaving. I couldn't talk to anyone about what was happening. Not my parents, not my friends. I was afraid they would think I was crazy, that they would dismiss my fears as nothing more than the imaginings of an overactive mind. So I kept it all to myself, the fear, the obsession, the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me day and night. But the more I kept it inside, the more it consumed me. One afternoon, after another restless night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't keep letting this thing control my life. I had to face it, had to find out what it was, once and for all. I waited until my parents were busy with their own tasks, and then slipped out of the house, heading for the edge of the woods. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. I hesitated at the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to turn back, to run home and lock the door behind me. But I couldn't. I had to know. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the forest. The change was immediate. The temperature dropped several degrees and the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. The ground was soft beneath my feet, covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the silence was deafening. Every sound I made seemed magnified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of a twig as I moved deeper into the woods. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I could feel the pulse of my heart in my throat. But I kept moving forward, driven by a mix of fear and determination. I didn't have a plan, didn't know what I would do if or when I found it. All I knew was that I had to keep going. The deeper I went, the more disorienting the forest became. The trees all looked the same, tall and ancient, their trunks twisted and gnarled as if they had grown out of the nightmares of some forgotten era. The underbrush grew thicker, thorny vines wrapping around my ankles, trying to pull me back. But I pushed on, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. And then I found it. At first, it was just a feeling, a shift in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and slowly turned in a circle, trying to pinpoint the source of my unease. And that's when I saw it, a figure standing motionless among the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and thin like the branches of the trees that surrounded it. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it seemed to shimmer in the dim light that filtered through the canopy. But it was the eyes that held me captive, large, black, and devoid of any emotion. They stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold, as if it could see straight through me into the darkest corners of my soul. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted to the spot, my mind screaming at me to run but my body refusing to obey. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched me, its head cocked slightly to one side, as if it was curious or perhaps amused by my fear. Finally, I forced myself to take a step back, and then another. But as I did, the figure began to move slowly, deliberately, matching my steps with its own. It didn't walk so much as glide, its feet barely touching the ground. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but I knew that if I did, it would chase me, and I didn't think I could outrun it. I kept backing away, my eyes locked on the figure as it continued to follow me, its movements eerily fluid, almost inhuman. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, clawing at my clothes, my skin. But I didn't stop, didn't dare look away, until I was nearly at the edge of the forest. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, just beyond the tree line, watching me with those empty black eyes. I took another step back, and then another, until I was out of the woods, standing in the open air of my backyard. But it didn't follow. I watched it for a long moment, half expecting it to step out of the shadows and come after me, but it just stood there, a silent sentinel in the darkness of the forest, watching, waiting. Finally, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my house, the door locked behind me. My parents were in the living room, oblivious to the terror that had unfolded just beyond our backyard. I didn't tell them what had happened, didn't mention the figure I had seen in the woods, but that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching me, and deep down I knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I avoided the forest after that, going out of my way to stay clear of the tree line, even in broad daylight. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was always there, lurking just out of sight. The sense of being watched never left me, a constant gnawing presence at the back of my mind. I started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams where I was back in the forest, the figure with the black eyes stalking me through the trees. In the dreams, I could never escape it, no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried to hide. It would always find me, its cold, bony hands reaching out to drag me back into the darkness. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and for a few moments I would be convinced that it was in the room with me, standing at the foot of my bed, waiting for me to fall back asleep. It got to the point where I was afraid to go to sleep, afraid of what I might see, what might be waiting for me in the darkness. My parents noticed the change in me, of course. I was pale, jumpy, exhausted all the time. They asked me if something was wrong, if I was having trouble at school, if I was sick, but I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain that I was being haunted by something in the woods, something that shouldn't exist? Instead, I lied. I told them I was just stressed out about school, that I wasn't sleeping well, that I was fine, but I could see the worry in their eyes, the way they exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I started spending more time away from home, finding excuses to stay out late with friends, or to go to the library after school. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me, that it was always just a few steps behind, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, one night, it did. It was a Friday, and I had gone out to the movies with a few friends. We had seen some forgettable horror flick, and I had spent the whole time too on edge to enjoy it. By the time we left the theatre, it was already dark, the sky overcast and threatening rain. My friends offered to give me a ride home, but I declined, needing some time to clear my head. I figured the walk would do me good, help me shake off the lingering anxiety that had been plaguing me all day. Besides, it was only a short walk back to my house, just a few blocks. But as I walked, the familiar sense of unease began to creep in. The streets were deserted, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement. I picked up my pace, my eyes darting nervously from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of a nearby alley, partially hidden in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs long and thin, its skin pale and ghostly in the dim light. Its eyes were black voids, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. For a moment we just stared at each other, the world around us falling away, and then, slowly, it began to move toward me. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted down the street, my footsteps echoing off the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, the soft rustle of its movements, the labored sound of its breathing. It was gaining on me, getting closer with every step. I rounded the corner onto my street, my house in sight, but I knew I wouldn't make it. It was too fast, too relentless. I could feel it right behind me, its icy breath on the back of my neck. And then, just as I reached my front yard, I tripped. I went down hard, my knees and palms scraping against the rough pavement. Pain shot through my legs, but I didn't have time to think about it. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the figure. But it was gone. I stood there panting, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for it to reappear, to finish what it had started. But the street was empty, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. Slowly I backed up toward my house, my eyes never leaving the spot where I had last seen it. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking, and unlocked the door, practically falling inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My parents were already in bed, the house silent and dark. I was alone, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. I barely left the house, too afraid of what might be waiting for me out there. The figure had made its intentions clear. It was coming for me, and I knew somehow that it wouldn't stop until it had me. I tried to stay awake, tried to keep my eyes open, but exhaustion eventually took its toll. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see it. Those black, soulless eyes staring into mine as if it was peering into the depths of my soul. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, more vivid and terrifying than ever before. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced that it was in the room with me. But when I opened my eyes, I was always alone. I knew I couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't talk to my parents, they wouldn't believe me. And I couldn't go to the police. What would I tell them? That I was being stalked by some kind of monster? No, I was on my own. I spent hours online, searching for any information I could find about the figure, about the woods near my house. But there was nothing. No records, no reports, nothing that matched what I had seen. It was as if it didn't exist, as if it was something out of a nightmare that had somehow crossed over into the real world. And then one night, as I was scrolling through yet another forum dedicated to urban legends and paranormal sightings, I found something. It was a post, buried deep in a thread about haunted forests, and it described an encounter that was eerily similar to mine. A pale, tall figure with black eyes that seemed to watch from the shadows. The post was old, from several years ago, and there were no replies, no follow-up. But the person who had written it had described the same sense of being watched, the same nightmares, the same growing obsession with the woods. And then, at the end of the post, there was a single sentence that sent a chill down my spine. It's watching you because it wants you to come back. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. Come back? To the woods? I closed my eyes, trying to think, to piece together the fragments of information I had gathered. The figure had appeared to me that night when I had entered the forest. It had followed me home, haunted my dreams, but it hadn't harmed me, not yet. But what if it wasn't just a random encounter? What if I had somehow awakened it? What if it wanted something from me? The thought terrified me, but it also gave me a strange sense of clarity. If the figure wanted me to come back to the woods, then maybe that was the key. Maybe if I went back, I could confront it, find out what it wanted, and put an end to this nightmare once and for all. It was a reckless idea, but I was out of options. I couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't keep running from something I didn't understand. I had to face it. I waited until the next night when my parents were asleep, and then I slipped out of the house. The air was cool, the sky clear, the stars shining brightly above. The forest loomed ahead of me, dark and foreboding, but I didn't hesitate. I had to see this through. The forest was just as I remembered it, cold and silent, the trees casting long shadows on the ground. I walked slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew that it would find me. And then, as I reached the spot where I had first seen the figure, I felt it. The same shift in the air, the same feeling of being watched. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and slowly turned. There it was, standing just a few feet away, its black eyes locked on mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting, and then it spoke. Its voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed through the trees like a thunderclap. "You came back." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head as if considering the question. "You." My heart skipped a beat. "Why? What are you?" The figure didn't answer right away. It just stared at me with those cold, empty eyes, its face unreadable. And then finally it spoke again. "I am the Watcher. I am the keeper of this place, the guardian of the boundary between worlds. And you have crossed that boundary." I shook my head, not understanding. "What do you mean? I didn't do anything." The Watcher's expression didn't change, but there was a hint of something in its voice, sadness maybe, or regret. "You entered the woods, you saw me, and now you belong to me." A cold chill ran down my spine. No, that's not true. I didn't." The Watcher stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate. "You have awakened something ancient, something that cannot be put back to sleep. You are bound to this place, to me, and you cannot escape." I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't understand. Please just let me go. I didn't mean to." But the Watcher shook its head. "It is too late. You are mine now. You will always be mine." Terror seized me and I turned to run, but the Watcher was suddenly in front of me, blocking my path. Its eyes bored into mine, and I felt a cold, icy grip on my soul, pulling me down into the darkness. "No!" I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the trees, by the night, by the Watcher's relentless gaze. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was lying on the forest floor, the cold earth pressing against my back. The sky above was still dark, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the silence was deafening. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. My mind was a fog of confusion and fear, my body aching from the fall. But then, slowly, the memories began to come back. The forest, the Watcher, its black eyes staring into mine. I sat up, my head spinning, and looked around. The trees loomed above me, tall and menacing, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But there was no sign of the Watcher. Had it really been real, or had it all been some kind of nightmare? I struggled to my feet, my legs shaking, and took a deep breath. I had to get out of here, had to get back to my house, to my parents, to safety. But as I turned to leave, I felt it, a presence just behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, and slowly turned around. The Watcher was there, standing just a few feet away, its eyes locked on mine. But this time there was no malice in its gaze, no threat. It just stared at me, its expression unreadable, its body still and silent. For a long moment neither of us moved. The world around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And then, finally, the Watcher spoke. "You are free to go." I blinked, not understanding. "What?" The Watcher tilted its head slightly, its black eyes reflecting the faint light of the stars. "I have seen into your soul. You are not like the others who have come before you. You have faced your fear, confronted the darkness, and in doing so you have broken the bond that tied you to this place." I stared at it, my mind struggling to comprehend what it was saying. "So, I'm free?" The Watcher nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Yes, but know this. Though you may leave this place, it will always be a part of you. The darkness you have seen, the fear you have faced, it will never fully leave you." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What happens now? The watcher's gaze didn't waver. You will go back to your life, but you will carry the memory of this place with you always, and should you ever return, I will be waiting. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I nodded, too afraid to argue, too relieved to question it. And then, without another word, the watcher turned and disappeared into the shadows, its pale form melting into the darkness of the forest. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to process what had just happened. And then, slowly, I turned and began to walk, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I finally emerged from the woods, the first light of dawn was just beginning to break over the horizon. The world felt strange, distant, as if I was seeing it through a fog, but I was alive, I was free, and I knew, deep down, that I would never be the same. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be, after what I had been through. The nightmares eventually faded, and the sense of being watched began to dissipate. But the memory of the watcher, of those black, soulless eyes, never left me. I avoided the woods from then on, never going near the tree line, never daring to enter the forest again. The fear was still there, buried deep inside me, but I had learned to live with it, to accept it as a part of who I was. Sometimes, late at night, I would find myself staring out the window, my eyes drawn to the dark line of trees in the distance. I would wonder if the watcher was still there, waiting, watching, biding its time, but I never saw it again, and in time I came to realize that the watcher had been right. Though I had left the woods, a part of me would always remain there, lost in the darkness, bound to that place by fear and memory. But I was alive. I had faced the darkness and survived, and that was enough. Years later, after I had moved away from my childhood home, I received a letter in the mail. It was from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who still lived in that small town near the woods. The letter was brief, but it sent a chill down my spine. I saw it. The watcher. It's still there, waiting. I don't know what to do. Please, help me. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. I had thought I was free, that I had escaped the darkness. But now it seemed the past was coming back to haunt me. And I knew deep down that I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't run from it. I had to go back. As I packed my bags and prepared to return to the town I had once called home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the watcher had more in store for me, that the darkness I had faced was only a taste of what was to come. But whatever awaited me in those woods, I knew I had to face it. I had to confront the fear, the darkness, the watcher once and for all, because some things, no matter how deeply they are buried, can never be truly forgotten. And the watcher in the woods was one of them.
I was just a child when I first heard about the well. It was one of those old, forgotten stories that only the oldest members of our small town seemed to know about. It wasn't something you could find in history books or local records. It was more of a ghost story, whispered around campfires or during sleepovers when the night was dark and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The well, they said, was cursed. It stood deep in the woods on the outskirts of town, far from the well-worn paths that people usually took when they wanted a quiet walk through nature. The trees around it were older, their branches thick and twisted, casting deep shadows that seemed to move even when there was no wind. The ground was uneven, covered in roots that snaked out like fingers, as if the forest itself was trying to keep people away from that place. No one knew exactly when the well was built, or by whom. Some said it had been there long before the town was founded, a relic from an earlier time, when different people lived in these woods. Others claimed it was dug by a madman, obsessed with finding something that had been lost to the ages, something dark and powerful. As I grew older, the stories became more detailed, more sinister. They said that the well was a doorway, a portal to another world, a world that was twisted, where things didn't follow the same rules as our own. Some said that if you listened closely, you could hear voices coming from the depths of the well, whispering secrets and promises, luring people closer and closer until they fell in. But the most terrifying story was about the disappearances. According to the tales, people had been going missing in those woods for generations. Some were children who had wandered too far from home. Others were hunters or travelers who had gotten lost. The common thread in all the stories was the well. It was always there, waiting, hungry. My grandmother used to tell me those stories when I was younger. She was one of the oldest residents in town. Her memory sharp, despite her age. Her voice would drop to a whisper when she spoke of the well, as if she was afraid that something might hear her. "Don't go into those woods," she would say, her eyes wide and serious. "The well is dangerous. It takes what it wants, and once you're lost to it, you're gone forever." At the time, I didn't believe her. I thought it was just another one of those ghost stories meant to scare children. But as I got older, I began to notice things. Every so often, there would be news of someone going missing. A hiker, a camper, sometimes even a local who should have known better. And every time, people would whisper about the well. My parents didn't like me playing too close to the woods. We lived on the edge of town, our backyard sloping down into a dense forest. They had never told me exactly why they were so strict about it, but I always assumed it was because of the stories. They would always give me a stern look when I asked about the well, and my mother would quickly change the subject. But the stories fascinated me. I would often sit at the edge of the yard, staring into the trees, wondering if the well was real. My friends and I would talk about it sometimes, daring each other to go into the woods and find it. But none of us ever had the courage to actually do it. It wasn't until I was 17 that I finally decided to go looking for the well. It was a stupid decision, one made out of boredom and the arrogance of youth. I had just finished high school, and the summer stretched out before me, long and empty. My friends had all gone on vacation with their families, and I was left alone in the small, quiet town. The stories about the well had faded over the years, pushed aside by more pressing concerns. College applications, part-time jobs, relationships. But they were still there, lurking in the back of my mind, whispering to me when the nights were long and my thoughts were restless. One day, with nothing better to do, I decided to go into the woods. I told myself it was just a walk, that I wasn't really looking for the well. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The forest was dense, the trees tall and thick, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of moss and earth. As I walked, the ground became uneven, the roots of the trees snaking out like veins beneath my feet. I had been walking for about an hour when I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest, the birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of insects, had faded, leaving only an eerie silence. The trees around me seemed older, their bark dark and rough, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. And then I saw it. The well stood in a small clearing, surrounded by tall, thick trees that seemed to press in on all sides. It was made of stone, the rocks worn and weathered with age. Vines crawled up its sides, and the ground around it was bare, as if nothing dared to grow too close. Panic set in as I struggled to sit up, my heart racing in my chest. My hands searched the ground around me, feeling the rough stone walls of the well, but there was no way out. The walls were smooth and slippery, offering no handholds, and the opening above was just a small circle of light, far out of reach. I was trapped. But as the panic threatened to overwhelm me, I remembered the whisper, the voice that had called to me, luring me into the well. It had to be down here, somewhere in the darkness. And if it had brought me here, maybe it could help me find a way out. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I had no choice but to move forward, to find the source of the voice and hope it would lead me to safety. Slowly, I began to crawl through the darkness, my hands feeling their way along the cold stone floor. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the well, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The whisper was faint, barely audible, but it was there, guiding me. The passageway was narrow and low, forcing me to crawl on my hands and knees. The walls were damp and covered in a slimy substance that made my skin crawl. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, and I had to fight the urge to gag. Time lost all meaning as I crawled through the darkness. Minutes, hours, it could have been days for all I knew. The only thing that kept me going was the whisper, that faint, haunting voice that seemed to be leading me deeper and deeper into the earth. Eventually, the passageway began to widen, and I found myself in a larger chamber. The air was colder here, the darkness even more oppressive. But there was something else, an overwhelming sense of dread that made my heart race and my breath catch in my throat. I stopped, my body trembling with fear. I could feel it now, the presence of something in the chamber with me, something ancient and malevolent. The whisper was louder now, clearer, and it was coming from the center of the chamber. Slowly, I crawled forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The ground beneath me was slick with some kind of viscous liquid, and the smell of rot was almost unbearable. But I had to keep going. I had to find out what was in the well. As I reached the center of the chamber, I felt a sudden shift in the air, as if something was moving in the darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my heart racing with terror. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and twisted, its form barely visible in the faint light that filtered down from above. It was humanoid in shape, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like it was made of something that wasn't quite solid. The whisper grew louder, echoing in my mind, and I realized it was coming from the figure. It was speaking directly to me, its voice soft and seductive, promising me things I couldn't comprehend. But beneath the whisper, there was something else, a deeper, more sinister voice that sent shivers down my spine. It was darker, more malevolent, and it filled me with a sense of dread unlike anything I had ever felt before. I wanted to run, to scream, to get away from that thing, but I was frozen in place, my body refusing to obey my commands. The figure moved closer, its twisted form looming over me, and I could feel its cold breath on my skin. It spoke to me, its voice echoing in my mind, filling me with thoughts that weren't my own. It told me things, terrible things, about the well, about the darkness that dwelled within it. It showed me visions of a world beyond our own, a world of shadows and nightmares, where things that defied comprehension lurked in the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. The whisper was gone, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on all sides. The chamber felt empty, hollow, as if whatever had been here had taken all the life with it. I was alone, trapped in the well, with no way out. I don't know how long I sat there in the darkness, my mind reeling from the encounter. My body ached, my head throbbed, and I could still feel the cold breath of the figure on my skin. But more than anything, I felt a deep, gnawing fear, a fear that I had stumbled into something far beyond my understanding, something that could consume me whole. But I couldn't stay in the well forever. I had to find a way out. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to stand. My legs were weak, trembling beneath me, and I had to lean against the wall for support. The chamber was silent, the oppressive darkness all-encompassing, but I couldn't let it consume me. I had to keep moving. I began to explore the chamber, my hands running along the rough stone walls. There had to be a way out, some kind of passage or tunnel that would lead me back to the surface. But the walls were solid, unyielding, and the floor was slick with that same viscous liquid that coated everything in the well. As I searched, I began to notice something strange, carvings on the walls, barely visible in the faint light. They were old, ancient even, worn smooth by time and the elements. The symbols were unfamiliar, twisted and angular, like nothing I'd ever seen before. But there was something about them that felt wrong, something that made my skin crawl. The symbols seemed to shift and change when I looked at them, as if they were alive, writhing on the stone like serpents. I forced myself to look away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what the carvings meant, but I could feel their power, their malevolence. They were connected to the well, to the darkness that dwelled within it. I continued my search, my hands trembling as I felt along the walls. And then, just when I was about to give up, I found it, a small opening, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. It was hidden behind a curtain of vines, the entrance to a tunnel that seemed to lead deeper into the earth. I hesitated, fear gnawing at my insides. The tunnel was dark, the air thick with the smell of decay, and I had no idea where it led. But it was the only way out, the only chance I had of escaping the well. Taking a deep breath, I crawled into the tunnel. The walls were close, pressing in on all sides, and the air was stifling, making it difficult to breathe. The ground was uneven, the floor covered in thick mud that sucked at my hands and knees, but I pushed forward, driven by the desperate need to escape. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the earth. The darkness was suffocating, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. After what felt like hours, the tunnel began to widen, and I found myself in another chamber. This one was larger than the first, the ceiling high above, shrouded in darkness. The air was colder here, the smell of decay even stronger, and the ground was littered with debris, broken stones, old bones, and other things I didn't want to think about. But there was something else in the chamber, something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, carved from the same stone as the walls, and on the pedestal was a book, old and worn, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was adorned with more of those twisted symbols, the same ones I had seen carved into the walls of the first chamber. The book radiated power, a dark, malevolent energy that seemed to pulse in the air around it. I could feel it calling to me, beckoning me closer, whispering promises of knowledge and power, but I knew better than to trust it. I had already been lured into the well by the whisper, and I wasn't about to fall into another trap. I forced myself to look away, my eyes scanning the chamber for another exit. But the only way out was a narrow passageway on the far side of the chamber, almost hidden by shadows. I made my way toward the passage, careful not to get too close to the pedestal. The air seemed to thicken as I approached the book, the darkness pressing in on all sides. But I kept my focus on the passage, ignoring the whispers that filled the chamber. Just as I reached the entrance to the passage, I heard a sound behind me, a low, rumbling growl that sent shivers down my spine. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw something emerging from the darkness. It was a creature, twisted and grotesque, its form barely visible in the faint light. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and its mouth was filled with jagged, razor-sharp teeth. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and the creature began to move toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. Panic surged through me, and I turned and fled down the passage, the growl echoing in my ears. The passage was narrow, the walls close, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. But I didn't care. All I could think about was getting away from that creature, from the well, from the darkness that seemed to be closing in around me. I ran for what felt like hours, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The passage twisted and turned, leading me deeper and deeper into the earth. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Eventually, the passage began to slope upward, and I felt a glimmer of hope. If I was going up, that meant I was getting closer to the surface, closer to escape. But as I rounded a corner, I skidded to a stop. The passage ended in a dead end, the way forward blocked by a wall of solid stone. I stared at the wall in disbelief, my heart sinking. There was no way out. I was trapped. The growl echoed down the passage, closer now, and I could hear the creature's footsteps, slow and deliberate, as it made its way toward me. Panic set in, and I began to claw at the wall, desperate to find some way out. But the stone was solid, unyielding, and my fingers scraped uselessly against it. The growl grew louder, and I could feel the creature's presence behind me, its cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned, my back pressed against the wall, and saw the creature looming over me, its eyes glowing with that sickly green light. I was out of options. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then, just as the creature lunged at me, something strange happened. The ground beneath my feet gave way, and I fell through the floor, tumbling into darkness. I awoke in a small, dimly lit chamber, my body bruised and battered from the fall. The air was cool and damp, and the walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with old, dusty books and strange, arcane objects. I was alive. Somehow, I had survived the fall, but I had no idea where I was or how I had ended up here. The chamber was silent, the only sound the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. The creature was nowhere to be seen, and I felt a small surge of relief. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to find a way out. I pushed myself to my feet, wincing as pain shot through my body. My head throbbed, and my vision swam for a moment before I steadied myself. As I looked around the chamber, I noticed something strange. The books on the shelves were old, their pages yellowed with age, but they were in pristine condition, as if they had been untouched for centuries. The objects on the shelves were equally strange: skulls, jars filled with strange, glowing liquids, and other things I couldn't even begin to identify. There was an air of ancient knowledge in the chamber, a sense that this place had been hidden away for a very long time. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl, a sense of malevolence, of dark power that lingered in the air like a foul odor. I cautiously approached one of the shelves, my eyes scanning the titles of the books. The language was unfamiliar, the letters twisted and angular, like the symbols I had seen carved into the walls of the well. But there was something about them that felt familiar, as if I had seen them before in a dream or a nightmare. As I reached out to touch one of the books, I felt a sudden surge of power, a jolt that sent shivers down my spine. The book was cold to the touch, its cover rough and worn, and as I opened it, I felt the darkness within it seep into my mind. The pages were filled with more of those twisted symbols, but as I stared at them, they began to shift and change, forming words that I could understand. The book was a journal, written by someone who had once lived in the town, long before it had become what it was today. The author spoke of the well, of the darkness that dwelled within it, and of the things they had discovered in their studies, dark, terrible secrets that had been forgotten by time. The author had been searching for something that had been lost in the well, a power that could change the world, a power that had been hidden away by those who feared it. But the author had also discovered the cost of that power, the price that had to be paid. The well, it seemed, was not just a portal to another world. It was a prison, a place where something ancient and terrible had been sealed away, something that had been forgotten by time, but had never truly been gone. The author spoke of the figure I had seen in the well, of the creature that had chased me through the passages. They were guardians, protectors of the darkness, bound to the well by the same power that had sealed it. But the author had also discovered a way to break that seal, a way to release the darkness and claim its power. The book spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, of things too terrible to comprehend. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to know anymore. I didn't want to be a part of whatever dark secret the well held. I had to get out of here. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something else on the shelf, a small ornate box, its surface covered in more of those twisted symbols. There was something about it that drew me in, something that felt important, like it held the key to escaping the well. I reached out and picked up the box, feeling the cold metal against my skin. It was heavier than it looked, and as I opened it, I saw a small, intricately carved key inside. The key was made of a strange, dark metal, and it seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy. But there was something about it that felt familiar, like I had seen it before, in the visions the figure had shown me. I knew without a doubt that this key was important. It was connected to the well, to the darkness, to everything that had happened, and it was my only way out. Taking the key, I made my way to the only exit from the chamber, a narrow doorway that led into another passage. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the passage, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. The key was important, and I had to find out what it unlocked. As I moved through the passage, I began to notice something strange. The walls were no longer made of stone, but of something else, something organic, like flesh. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and I could hear the faint, distant sound of whispers, like the voices from the well. The passage twisted and turned, leading me deeper and deeper into the earth. The walls seemed to pulse and writhe, as if they were alive, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A door set into the wall at the end of the passage. The door was made of the same dark metal as the key, and it was covered in those twisted symbols, glowing faintly in the darkness. I knew, without a doubt, that this was the way out. With trembling hands, I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairway that led up into the darkness. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of rot was even stronger now, almost overpowering. But I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of the well, escaping the darkness that had consumed me. I began to climb the stairs, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The steps were uneven, slick with moisture, and the walls were close, pressing in on all sides. But I kept going, driven by the desperate need to escape. As I climbed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my mind with dark thoughts and terrible images. But I pushed them aside, focusing on the light that I could see at the top of the stairs, the faint glimmer of hope that I might make it out alive. The stairs seemed to go on forever, winding up and up, the darkness pressing in on all sides. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the top. I emerged into a small, circular chamber, the air cold and still. The walls were made of the same dark metal as the door, and in the center of the room stood a pedestal, identical to the one I had seen in the chamber below. On the pedestal was another book, its cover adorned with more of those twisted symbols. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the book. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to know what dark secrets it held, but I knew I had no choice. I had to find out what the book said, had to know what I was dealing with. With a deep breath, I opened the book. The pages were filled with more of those twisted symbols, but as I stared at them, they began to shift and change, forming words that I could understand. The book spoke of the well, of the darkness that had been sealed away, and of the terrible power that lay within it. It spoke of the key, of the door that led to the heart of the well, and of the ritual that had to be performed to release the darkness. The ritual was terrible, requiring sacrifices and incantations too dark to comprehend, but it promised power beyond imagining, a way to reshape the world to one's own will. But there was a warning as well, a warning that once the darkness was released, it could not be controlled. It would consume everything in its path, leaving nothing but destruction and despair in its wake. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want anything to do with the ritual, with the darkness, with the well. I just wanted to get out, to leave this place and never come back. But as I turned to leave, I heard a sound behind me, a low, rumbling growl, like the one I had heard in the passage below. I turned, my heart racing, and saw the creature from the well emerging from the shadows, its eyes glowing with that sickly green light. The creature moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its growl echoing in the chamber. I could feel the cold breath on my skin, the malevolent presence pressing in on all sides. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The door behind me was locked, the key nowhere to be found. I was trapped. The creature lunged at me, its jaws snapping shut inches from my face. I dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding its teeth, and scrambled to the far side of the chamber. The creature turned, its eyes locked on me, and lunged again. This time, I wasn't fast enough. The creature's jaws closed around my arm, its teeth sinking into my flesh, and I screamed in pain. But as the creature bit down, I felt something strange. A surge of energy, a pulse of dark power that seemed to radiate from the book, from the key, from the well itself. The creature recoiled, releasing its grip on my arm, and I felt the energy coursing through me, filling me with a strength I had never known. I didn't know what was happening, didn't understand the power that was flowing through me, but I knew I had to use it, had to fight back. With a roar, I lunged at the creature, my hands glowing with that same sickly green light. The creature howled in pain as my hands made contact, and I felt the energy surging through me, burning through the creature's flesh like fire. The creature writhed and twisted, its body contorting in pain, but I didn't let go. I could feel the power flowing through me, consuming the creature, burning it from the inside out. And then, with a final, agonized scream, the creature disintegrated into ash, leaving nothing but a faint green glow in its wake. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion. The power that had surged through me was gone, leaving me weak and drained. But I was alive. Somehow I had survived. As I lay there on the cold metal floor, I realized that I had escaped the well. escape the darkness that had threatened to consume me. But I knew deep down that I would never be the same. The well had changed me, marked me in some way. The power that had saved me was still there, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting to be called upon. And I knew that one day I would have to face the darkness again. But for now, I was free. Free to leave the well, to leave the town, to leave the past behind. But as I stood up and made my way to the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the well wasn't done with me yet. The darkness was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when it did, I would be ready.
It started with the dreams. They began as innocuous fragments, a field under a starless sky, an ocean of grass swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. I would wake up with the scent of earth and something metallic lingering in my nose, the taste of salt on my lips. At first, I brushed them off as nothing more than the residue of an overactive imagination, the subconscious mind playing its usual tricks. But then the dreams became more vivid, more real. I found myself in a vast underground cavern, the walls and ceiling disappearing into an inky darkness that swallowed all light. The ground was cold and damp beneath my feet, slick with a thin film of water that rippled with each hesitant step I took. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something far worse, something I couldn't place but that made my stomach turn. In the dreams, I was always alone, but I could feel something in the darkness, just out of sight, watching me, waiting. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around me, my heart pounding as if I had been running for miles. The taste of salt was always there, bitter and sharp, as if I had been drinking seawater. As the nights wore on, the dreams grew more intense, more detailed. I began to notice things in the cavern, scratches on the walls, strange symbols carved into the stone, all of them leading deeper into the darkness. My fear grew with each dream, but so did my curiosity. I couldn't help myself. Each night, I would venture further into the cavern, driven by a need to understand, to find the source of the strange pull that seemed to draw me deeper. But the dreams were only the beginning. It wasn't long before the dreams began to bleed into my waking life. It started with small things, flashes of the cavern when I closed my eyes, the faint echo of dripping water when I was alone in my apartment. The scent of earth and salt clung to me, no matter how many times I showered or washed my clothes. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting just beyond the edge of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. I began to hear things as well, whispers in the darkness, low and guttural like the muttering of some ancient language. They were always just barely audible, just beyond the threshold of comprehension, leaving me with a constant sense of unease. The words, if they could be called that, seemed to seep into my mind, repeating themselves over and over, like a chant. My sleep became fitful, restless, plagued by the same dream over and over. Each night I would find myself deeper in the cavern, the walls closing in around me, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. The symbols on the walls became more intricate, more disturbing, as if they were trying to tell me something I was just on the verge of understanding. But it wasn't just the dreams that were changing. I was changing too. I became withdrawn, avoiding my friends and family, not out of choice, but out of necessity. I couldn't explain what was happening to me, couldn't make them understand. How could I? I didn't understand it myself. I was losing time, hours slipping away without me noticing, and when I would come to, I would find myself in strange places, dark alleyways, abandoned buildings, places I had no memory of going. And always there was the cavern, the darkness, the whispers. One night after another of those exhausting, terrifying dreams, I awoke with a start. My throat was dry and my head ached with a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to pulse in time with the words that still echoed in my mind. I fumbled for the glass of water I kept on the nightstand, but my hand knocked it over, sending it clattering to the floor. Cursing under my breath, I got out of bed and made my way to the bathroom. The apartment was silent, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzzing of the fluorescent light in the hallway. I splashed some water on my face, trying to shake the remnants of the dream that clung to me like a shroud. But when I looked up at the mirror, I froze. For a moment, I didn't recognize the face staring back at me. It was my face, but it was wrong. My skin was pale, almost grey, and my eyes were sunken, dark circles standing out starkly against the pallor of my skin. My hair hung limp and lifeless, and my lips were cracked and dry, tinged with a faint blue. I blinked, and the reflections seemed to shimmer, to shift, as if the glass itself were rippling like water. I stepped back, my heart racing, but when I looked again, my reflection was normal, if a bit haggard. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, a result of too little sleep and too much stress. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind like a rat. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my thoughts consumed by the dream, by the reflection in the mirror, by the whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing hour. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't concentrate on anything. My co-workers noticed, casting concerned glances my way, but I brushed them off, insisting that I was just tired, that I hadn't been sleeping well. That night, I didn't dream. I didn't sleep at all. Instead, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite grasp. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, a constant hum in the back of my mind that I couldn't ignore. They were insistent, demanding, pulling me towards something I couldn't see but that I could feel, deep in my bones. It was as if something was calling to me from the depths of the earth, something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting for me, specifically me, for a very long time. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that I would have to answer. The next morning, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods on the outskirts of town. I didn't remember driving there, didn't remember getting out of bed or leaving my apartment. But there I was, the early morning mist curling around my feet, the trees looming tall and foreboding before me. The air was thick with the scent of earth and moss, and the ground beneath me was soft and damp, sinking slightly under my weight. The woods had always been a place of mystery and fear, the kind of place parents warned their children to avoid. There were stories, of course, the kind of stories every town has. Stories of people who had gone into the woods and never returned, of strange lights and sounds that could be heard in the dead of night, of creatures that lurked in the shadows, waiting to pounce on the unwary. But those were just stories, weren't they? The whispers were louder now, more urgent, like a chorus of voices chanting in unison. They seemed to be coming from deep within the woods, drawing me forward, pulling me towards something I couldn't see but that I knew was there, waiting for me. I should have been afraid. I should have turned around, gotten back in my car, and driven as far away as I could. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong. The need to know, to understand, too overwhelming. I took a step forward, then another, and before I knew it, I was walking into the woods, the trees closing in around me like a cage. The path was narrow, barely more than a deer trail, winding its way deeper into the forest, the undergrowth thick and tangled. The light grew dimmer the further I went, the trees blocking out the sun, casting everything in a greenish twilight hue. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could almost make out words now, fragments of sentences that slipped through my mind like water through my fingers. "Come, below, join us!" I stumbled over a root, catching myself just in time before I fell. My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. The air was thick and heavy, and I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on me, the ground itself seeming to pulse with some hidden, ancient rhythm. And then I saw it. The cave. It was hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy and moss, almost invisible in the dim light of the forest. The entrance was small, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, and it descended steeply into the darkness, the walls slick with moisture. The whispers were deafening now, echoing off the walls of the cave, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices, all of them urging me forward, urging me to descend, to come down, to join them. I hesitated at the entrance, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. I was too far gone, too deeply ensnared by whatever force had drawn me here. I took a deep breath and stepped into the cave. The descent was slow and treacherous, the walls of the cave narrowing around me, the air growing colder and more stale with each step. The light from my phone was weak, barely penetrating the thick darkness that surrounded me, and I had to be careful not to slip on the wet stone beneath my feet. The whispers were all around me now, echoing off the walls, filling the cave with a low, constant hum. They were clearer now, more distinct, and I could hear the voices, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, all speaking in unison, chanting in a language I didn't understand, but that resonated deep within me. The passageway twisted and turned, descending deeper and deeper into the earth. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and I could feel the weight of the stone pressing down on me, the darkness closing in from all sides. But still I pressed on, driven by a force I couldn't resist, couldn't fight. And then suddenly, the passageway opened up into a vast cavern. I stepped out onto a narrow ledge, my breath catching in my throat as I took in the sight before me. The cavern was enormous, stretching out into the darkness, the ceiling lost in the shadows above. The walls were lined with strange, glowing symbols, the same symbols I had seen in my dreams, their light casting an eerie, sickly glow over everything. But it was what lay in the center of the cavern that stole my breath away. A massive circular pit, easily 100 feet across, gaped open in the center of the cavern, its edges lined with ancient, weathered stone. The pit was deep, impossibly deep, and the light from the symbols barely penetrated the darkness that filled it. But I could feel it, the pull, the same pull that had drawn me here, stronger now, almost overwhelming. And as I stood there staring down into the abyss, I saw them, figures moving in the darkness just at the edge of my vision. They were tall and thin, their limbs elongated and twisted, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. Their eyes glowed with a faint, sickly light, and their mouths moved in silent chants, the whispers echoing in my mind. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I wanted to run to get as far away from this place as possible, but I couldn't. The pull was too strong, the need to know, to understand, too overwhelming. And then, from the darkness of the pit, something began to rise. It was massive, far larger than any of the figures, a hulking, shadowy form that seemed to absorb the light around it, casting everything into deeper darkness. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, slick with moisture and filth, and its limbs were long and twisted, ending in sharp, clawed hands. Its head was a grotesque mockery of a human face, with deep, hollow eyes that glowed with a malevolent light and a mouth filled with rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. It was the source of the whispers, the source of the pull, the thing that had been calling to me, drawing me here, and it was hungry. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, the sound reverberating through the cavern, shaking the very ground beneath my feet. I could feel its eyes on me, burning into me, stripping away everything I was, everything I had ever been. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot by a terror so profound it felt like my mind was unraveling. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each step sending ripples through the darkness that surrounded it. The figures in the cavern, the twisted, elongated beings, began to move as well, their chants growing louder, more frenzied, as if they were urging the creature on, urging it to claim me. A small, quiet voice, barely audible over the cacophony of whispers, spoke in my mind, cutting through the noise, the fear, the darkness. Remember. And I did. I remembered the dreams, the reflection in the mirror, the whispers, the pull, the cave, the pit, the creature. I remembered the fear, the confusion, the feeling of being lost, of being drawn into something far beyond my understanding. But I also remembered something else, the surface, the light, the warmth of the sun on my skin, the feel of the earth beneath my feet, solid and steady, the people I had left behind, the life I had lived before all of this began. I remembered who I was, and in that moment something shifted. The whispers faltered, their rhythm breaking, the chanting voices growing confused, uncertain. The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as if it could sense the change, as if it knew that something was wrong. I took a step back, then another, the fog in my mind beginning to clear, the pull weakening, the darkness receding. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking but firm. "You can't have me." The creature let out a roar, a sound of pure primal rage, and lunged forward, its massive claws reaching for me. But I was ready. I turned and ran. The cavern seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around me, the darkness growing thicker with each step. I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground, the whispers growing louder, more desperate, as if they were trying to drag me back, to pull me down into the abyss. But I kept running, pushing myself harder, faster, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know if there was a way out, but I couldn't stop, couldn't let it catch me. The ground was slick beneath my feet, and I stumbled, nearly falling, but I caught myself just in time, the adrenaline surging through my veins, giving me the strength to keep going. The walls of the cavern seemed to shift and warp around me, the symbols glowing brighter, their light almost blinding. But I forced myself to focus, to keep moving. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light far ahead, barely visible in the darkness. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to give me hope. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort, my lungs screaming for air, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was so close. The light grew brighter, stronger, and I could feel the darkness behind me beginning to recede, the whispers growing fainter, more distant. The creature let out another roar, a sound of frustration and anger, but it was getting further away, the pull weakening with each step I took. And then, finally, I reached the light. It was a narrow opening, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, but it was enough. I forced myself through, the rough stone scraping against my skin, tearing at my clothes, but I didn't care. I could feel the sunlight on my face, warm and comforting, the air fresh and clean, free of the stench of decay and death. I stumbled out into the open air, collapsing onto the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion, my mind reeling from the experience. The sunlight was blinding after the darkness of the cavern, and I had to shield my eyes, but I could feel it, the warmth, the life, the world above. I was safe. For a long time I just lay there, breathing in the fresh air, letting the warmth of the sun soak into my skin, grounding myself, reminding myself that I was alive, that I had escaped. But even as I lay there, the memory of the cavern, the creature, the whispers, lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that I knew would never fully go away. I had escaped, but I wasn't free. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal life, but nothing was the same. The world felt different, less real, as if I was still trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The memories of the cavern, the creature, the abyss haunted me, replaying in my mind over and over, the whispers still echoing in the back of my mind, faint but persistent. I avoided mirrors, avoided the dark, avoided anything that might remind me of what I had seen, of where I had been. But it was impossible to escape it completely. The scent of earth and salt still clung to me. No matter how many times I showered, the taste of seawater still lingered on my lips. And every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I would catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, something dark and twisted, something that shouldn't be there. The creature was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The pull was still there, faint but unmistakable, a constant tug at the edges of my mind, urging me to return, to descend once more into the darkness, to join them. But I fought it. Every day I fought it. I surrounded myself with light, with life, with people, anything to keep the darkness at bay, to keep the whispers from growing louder, from taking over. I tried to live my life as best I could, to find some semblance of normalcy, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. But I wouldn't give in. I couldn't. I had seen the abyss, stared into its depths, felt its pull. But I had escaped. And as long as I could hold on to that, as long as I could remember who I was, what I had, I could keep the darkness at bay. But the whispers were always there, a constant reminder that it was never really over, that the abyss was always waiting just below the surface, ready to pull me back in. And I knew that one day somehow it would come for me. But until then, I would fight. The nights were the hardest. During the day, I could distract myself with work, with people, with the noise and bustle of the world around me. But at night, when everything was quiet, when I was alone, the darkness would creep in, bringing the whispers with it. I kept the lights on, kept the TV playing in the background, anything to drown out the silence, to keep the whispers at bay. But it was never enough. They were always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when I would close my eyes, when I would let my guard down, The dreams returned too, more vivid and terrifying than ever. I was back in the cavern, the walls closing in around me, the darkness suffocating, the creature's eyes glowing in the shadows. I could hear the whispers, louder now, more insistent, urging me to come back, to return to the abyss to join them. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the taste of salt on my lips, the scent of earth and decay clinging to me. I would lie there for hours, unable to sleep, too afraid to close my eyes, knowing that the moment I did, I would be back in the cavern, back in the darkness. I began to lose weight, my skin growing pale and sallow, my eyes hollow and sunken. My friends noticed, but I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I? They would never understand. They would think I was crazy, that I was losing my mind. And maybe I was. The whispers grew louder, more persistent, the pull stronger. I could feel it every moment of every day, a constant gnawing hunger that I couldn't ignore. The creature was calling to me, and I knew that I couldn't resist it forever, but I had to try. One night, after yet another sleepless night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep running from the darkness, from the creature, from the abyss. I had to face it, had to confront whatever it was that had taken hold of me, had to find a way to break free. I packed a bag with a flashlight, some food and water, a rope, anything I thought I might need. I didn't know what I was going to do, didn't have a plan, but I knew that I had to go back, had to return to the cave, to the cavern, to the place where it had all begun. I left a note for my friends, telling them not to worry, that I would be back soon, but I didn't believe it myself. I knew that there was a very real chance that I wouldn't return, that the darkness would claim me, that I would be lost forever in the abyss. But I had to try. I drove to the edge of the woods, the same place where I had found myself before, and parked the car. The woods were dark and silent, the trees looming tall and foreboding, the air thick with the scent of earth and moss. The pull was stronger now, almost overwhelming. The whispers a constant hum in the back of my mind, urging me forward, urging me to return. I took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. The path was familiar, the same narrow trail winding its way deeper into the forest, the undergrowth thick and tangled. The light from my flashlight was weak, barely penetrating the darkness, but I could feel the pull, stronger now, guiding me, leading me back to the cave, to the abyss. The whispers grew louder with each step, the air growing colder, the scent of decay and salt growing stronger. I could feel the ground beneath me pulsing with that same ancient rhythm, the weight of the earth pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, just as before, I saw it. The cave. It was hidden behind the same curtain of ivy and moss, the entrance small and narrow, descending steeply into the darkness. The whispers were deafening now, echoing off the walls of the cave, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices, all of them urging me forward, urging me to descend, to come down, to join them. But this time I was ready. I took a deep breath and stepped into the cave, the darkness swallowing me whole. The descent was slow, the walls of the cave narrowing around me, the air growing colder and more stale with each step. The light from my flashlight flickered, barely holding the darkness at bay, but I forced myself to keep moving, to push forward. The passageway twisted and turned, descending deeper and deeper into the earth, the air growing thicker, harder to breathe. The whispers were all around me, louder now, more insistent, but I blocked them out, focusing on the task at hand, on the need to find the source, to confront whatever it was that had taken hold of me. And then, just as before, the passageway opened up into the vast cavern. I stepped out onto the narrow ledge, my breath catching in my throat as I took in the sight before me. The cavern was exactly as I remembered it, the walls lined with glowing symbols, the pit gaping open in the center, the darkness swirling within it, alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy. But this time, I wasn't alone. The creature was there, waiting for me, its massive form hunched over the edge of the pit, its glowing eyes fixed on me, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The figures, the twisted, elongated beings, were there as well, their chants growing louder, more frenzied, urging the creature on, urging it to claim me. But I was ready. I reached into my bag and pulled out the rope, tying one end around my waist, the other to a large rock that jutted out from the ledge. I didn't know if it would be enough, didn't know if it would work, but it was all I had, my last hope. The creature let out a roar, a sound of pure primal rage, and lunged forward, its massive claws reaching for me. But this time I didn't run, I jumped. The darkness swallowed me, the air rushing past me as I fell, the whispers growing louder, more frenzied, as if they were celebrating, as if they were rejoicing in my surrender. But I wasn't surrendering. The rope jerked taut, the rock holding firm, and I swung down into the pit, the light from my flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing the walls of the abyss, covered in the same glowing symbols, the same ancient markings. But there was something else, something deeper, something hidden beneath the symbols, something that pulsed with a dark, twisted energy, something that seemed to throb with life. I reached out, my hand brushing against the wall, and I felt it. It was alive. The wall, the cavern, the pit, it was all alive, all part of the same twisted ancient entity. The same force that had been pulling me, drawing me down into the abyss. And I knew in that moment what I had to do. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, as if they could sense what I was about to do, as if they were trying to stop me. The creature roared, its massive form looming above me, its claws reaching down, trying to drag me back up, trying to stop me. But I was ready. I reached into my bag and pulled out the knife, the blade sharp and gleaming in the dim light. The whispers screamed, the creature roared, but I didn't hesitate. I drove the knife into the wall. The cavern shook, the ground trembling beneath me, the walls cracking, the symbols flickering, their light growing dim. The whispers faltered, their voices breaking, the rhythm disrupted, the pull weakening. I drove the knife in deeper, twisting it, feeling the wall give way beneath the blade, feeling the life, the dark, twisted energy, begin to drain away. The creature let out a final, ear-piercing scream, its form dissolving into the darkness. The figures in the cavern writhing and twisting, their chants faltering, breaking, until there was nothing but silence. And then, the cavern collapsed. I woke up in the hospital, my body battered and bruised, my mind hazy and confused. My friends were there, their faces pale with worry, their voices soft and comforting. They told me that I had been found in the woods, unconscious, covered in dirt and blood, but alive. I didn't tell them what had happened, didn't tell them about the cavern, the creature, the abyss. I didn't need to. I could feel it. The pull was gone, the whispers silenced, the darkness receding, replaced by the warmth of the sun, the light of the world above. I had faced the abyss, stared into its depths, and survived. And as I lay there in that hospital bed, surrounded by the people I cared about, I knew that I was finally free. Free from the darkness, free from the creature, free from the abyss. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope, but the scars remained. The memories of the cavern, the creature, the abyss still haunted me, still lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that I knew would never fully go away. The world felt different, less real, as if I was still trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The taste of salt still lingered on my lips, the scent of earth and decay still clung to me, no matter how many times I showered. And every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I would catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, something dark and twisted, something that shouldn't be there. But I was free, and I would keep fighting, keep pushing forward, keep living no matter what, because I had survived the abyss, and I would never go back.
The Forgotten Cabin. When I was a child, my parents often took us to our family's old cabin in the woods. It was a small, rustic place, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. There was no electricity, no running water, just the bare necessities. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the world outside ceased to exist. I remember the smell of pine and damp earth, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I remember the silence, the deep, almost oppressive quiet that hung over the forest like a shroud. It was a place that both fascinated and frightened me, a place where the boundaries between reality and imagination seemed to blur. The cabin had been in our family for generations, passed down from my great-grandfather to my grandfather and then to my father. It was a place of history, of memories, of secrets. My father often told us stories about the cabin, tales of the strange and eerie things that had happened there over the years. Most of them were just that, stories. But there was one story that he never told, one that he kept to himself, locked away in the deepest recesses of his mind. I didn't think much of it at the time. To me, the cabin was just a place to escape the city, to explore the woods, to get lost in my own little world. But as I grew older, I began to notice things, small, unsettling things that didn't quite add up. There was the cellar, for one. My father always kept it locked, and he never let us go down there. "It's just storage," he would say if we asked. "Nothing to see." But I remember the look in his eyes when he said it, the way his voice would grow tense, as if he was hiding something. Then there were the strange noises at night, the creaking of the floorboards, the soft, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to come from the walls. I would lie in bed, listening, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. My brother and sister never seemed to notice, but I did. I always did. But it wasn't until I was a teenager that I truly began to understand the darkness that lingered in that place. It was the summer of my 16th year, the last time we went to the cabin as a family. My brother had just turned 18 and was preparing to go off to college, while my sister, 3 years younger than me, was still lost in the innocence of childhood. My parents decided it would be our last big family trip before everything changed. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked the same as it always had, weathered and worn, yet somehow still standing, still defiant against the passage of time. My father unlocked the door, and we stepped inside, greeted by the familiar smell of dust and old wood. For the first few days, everything was normal. We hiked, we fished, we roasted marshmallows by the fire, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense of something unspoken hanging in the air. My father seemed distant, preoccupied, his eyes constantly darting toward the forest, as if he was expecting something or someone to emerge from the trees. Then one night, everything changed. It was late, the fire had died down, and we were all preparing to go to bed when we heard it, a loud rhythmic banging coming from the cellar door. My father froze, his face draining of color. My mother looked at him, fear in her eyes. My siblings and I stared at each other, unsure of what to do. The banging continued, louder and more insistent, like something was trying to break free. My father grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the cellar, my mother close behind him. "Stay here," she whispered to us, her voice trembling. "Don't move." We watched as they disappeared into the darkness, the light from the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The banging grew louder, more frantic, and then suddenly it stopped. There was a long, tense silence, and then we heard it. A blood-curdling scream, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My sister started to cry, and my brother grabbed her, pulling her close. "Stay here," he whispered to me, his voice shaking. "I'll go check." But before he could move, the cellar door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The only sound was the rapid thudding of my heart, pounding in my ears like a drum. I reached out for my brother, but he wasn't there. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything around me, and for a terrifying second, I felt like I was floating in a void, lost in the blackness. Then a small, dim light appeared, a flickering, sputtering beam coming from my father's flashlight, lying on the floor just a few feet away. I scrambled toward it, my hands trembling, and picked it up, shining the beam around the room. The cabin was empty. My brother, my sister, my parents, they were gone. The only thing left was the open cellar door, a gaping black hole in the middle of the floor, like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. I stared at the cellar door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made, only terror. And then from deep within the cellar, I heard it. A soft, wet sound, like something being chewed, followed by a low, guttural growl. Something was down there. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I had to get out of there. I had to find my family, to escape this nightmare. But as I turned to run, the cellar door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I was alone, in the dark, with whatever was down there. I shone the flashlight around the room, searching for any sign of an exit, but there was nothing. The windows were barred. The door was locked from the outside. The only way out was through the cellar. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and forced myself to move forward, my legs shaking. I had no choice. I had to find my family, to save them from whatever horror was lurking below. As I approached the cellar door, the growling grew louder, more insistent, like it knew I was coming. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle, fear coursing through my veins. But I couldn't stop now. I had to be brave. I had to face whatever was waiting for me. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and pulled the door open. The smell hit me first, a foul, rancid stench that made my stomach turn. I gagged, covering my mouth and nose with my hand, and shone the flashlight down the stairs. The beam of light barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only the first few steps, slick with some kind of dark, wet substance. I took a cautious step forward, my heart racing, and then another. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through the darkness. I could hear the growling, closer now, just beyond the edge of the light. My hands were shaking so badly that the flashlight wobbled, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then, just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the light caught something. A figure, crouched in the corner, its back to me. It was large, hunched over, its limbs twisted and misshapen, covered in matted, filthy fur. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned slowly, its eyes glinting in the darkness, and I saw its face, a grotesque, monstrous thing, half human, half beast, with sharp, jagged teeth and glowing red eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature snarled, its lips curling back to reveal rows of sharp, yellowed teeth, and then it lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered across the floor, the beam flickering out, leaving me in total darkness. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing, feel its hot, rancid breath on my face as it loomed over me, its claws inches from my throat. And then, just as it was about to strike, the cellar door slammed open, and a blinding light filled the room. The creature screeched in pain, recoiling from the light, and I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and shining it at the thing. It backed away, snarling, its eyes narrowing to slits as it was forced into the corner. And then, without warning, it turned and bolted up the stairs, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there panting, my heart racing, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I had to get out of there. I rushed up the stairs, out of the cellar, and into the cabin. The light was still on, casting long, eerie shadows across the room, but there was no sign of the creature. I had to find my family. I had to get them out of there before it was too late. The cabin was deathly quiet, the silence only broken by my ragged breathing and the faint creaking of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. My hands were slick with sweat, my pulse thundering in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee from this place and never look back. But I couldn't leave without my family. I moved cautiously, shining the flickering beam of the flashlight around the room. The cabin, once a sanctuary of childhood memories, now felt alien and foreboding, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The furniture, the old rugs, the dusty shelves, all were just as they had always been. Yet now they seemed twisted, wrong, like pieces of a nightmare come to life. I called out softly, "Mom? Dad?" My voice was weak, trembling, but the words echoed back at me, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. No answer. I edged closer to the door that led outside, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But before I could turn it, a low, guttural growl rumbled from the direction of the cellar. I froze, heart pounding, and slowly turned my head. The cellar door was still wide open, a yawning black maw leading into the depths below. The growl came again, louder this time, more menacing. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't gone. It was waiting. I had to get out. I had to get my family out. Without wasting another second, I threw open the cabin door and bolted into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it did little to clear the haze of fear clouding my mind. I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scratching at my skin, the flashlight's beam bouncing erratically as I ran. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "Where are you?" My voice was lost in the vast expanse of the forest. The trees loomed tall and shadowy, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the moonlight. It felt as though the forest itself was conspiring against me, drawing me deeper into its depths, away from safety. But then I heard something. Soft footfalls, rustling leaves. I turned sharply, shining the flashlight in the direction of the sound. "Mom?" I whispered, hope flaring in my chest. But it wasn't my mother, it was my brother, emerging from the darkness, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn, but he was alive. "Thank God!" I gasped, rushing toward him. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip tight, almost painful. "We have to go," he said urgently, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here now." "What happened? Where are Mom and Dad?" He shook his head, his eyes darting nervously around us. "I don't know. I heard something in the woods. It wasn't human. We need to leave before it finds us." Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We can't leave without them. We have to find them." "They're gone," he snapped, his voice cracking with fear. "Whatever that thing was, it got them. We're next if we don't leave now." I wanted to argue, to insist that we couldn't abandon our parents, but the terror in his eyes stopped me. He was right. We were in danger. Whatever that creature was, it was hunting us. If we stayed, we would die. "Okay," I whispered, swallowing the lump of fear in my throat. "Okay, let's go." We turned and ran, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness as we stumbled through the trees. The forest was a maze of shadows, every sound amplified by the silence around us. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the pounding of our own footsteps. But then, as we rounded a bend in the path, we skidded to a stop. There, standing in the middle of the trail, was the creature. It was even more grotesque in the moonlight, its twisted limbs and matted fur slick with blood. Its red eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, and its lips curled back in a snarl, revealing those sharp, yellowed teeth. It let out a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver of terror down my spine. We were trapped. My brother took a step back, his breath hitching in his throat. "Run," he whispered, "run!" But there was nowhere to run. The creature blocked our path, and the dense forest loomed on either side. We were surrounded with no way out. The creature tensed, ready to pounce, and then, from somewhere behind us, a blinding light erupted, flooding the forest with an intense, searing brightness. The creature howled in pain, recoiling from the light, its twisted form writhing in agony. I turned, shielding my eyes from the glare, and saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, holding a powerful flashlight. The figure stepped forward, and my heart leaped as I recognized the face. It was my father. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice fierce and commanding. "Go now!" He didn't need to tell us twice. My brother and I turned and ran, our feet pounding the forest floor as the creature's agonized screams echoed behind us. I didn't look back, too terrified to see what might be happening. We ran until we burst through the tree line into the clearing where our car was parked. My brother fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, before finally unlocking the doors. We threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut behind us. As the engine roared to life, I dared a glance back at the cabin. The light was still blazing from the forest, but the creature was nowhere in sight, and neither was my father. "Go!" I shouted, and my brother didn't hesitate, flooring the gas pedal and sending the car hurtling down the dirt road. The cabin, the forest, the creature, they all disappeared into the night, swallowed by the darkness as we sped away, leaving everything behind. We never spoke about that night again. Not to each other, not to anyone. Whatever happened in that cabin, whatever my father had done to save us, it was a secret we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. But deep down, I knew the truth. The cabin had always been more than just a place to escape. It was a place of history, of memories, of secrets, dark, terrible secrets that had been buried for generations. And now, they had finally been unleashed. I never saw my father again after that night. He disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the darkness, just like the creature. My brother and I never returned to the cabin, and as far as I know, it still stands there, forgotten and abandoned, a relic of a past best left buried. But sometimes in the dead of night, I dream of that place, of the smell of pine and damp earth, of the eerie silence that hung over the forest like a shroud. And in those dreams, I hear the growl of the creature, the creak of the cellar door, and my father's voice calling out to me from the darkness. Run. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing.